The Witch of Pungo. Grace Sherwood was born Grace White to John and Susan White around the year 1660 in Pungo, Virginia, which was then part of Princess Anne County. Her family were landowners and farmers in the area, and her father was also a carpenter, so she came from a very well-respected family in the area. In 1680, Grace married James Sherwood, who was a local landowner and farmer and was also highly respected in the community. They had 3 children together, John, Richard, and James Jr. So Grace really was just living the typical life of a woman in the 1600s. She was a wife, she was a mother, and she lived out her life on her farm and in her little community. So upon the death of Grace's father, he left her and James 145 acres of land, leaving them very well off for the time. So again, they lived their lives on this farm. They were known to attend their local church every week. However, Grace was also known to be a healer. She was a good midwife. She had an excellent knowledge of herbs and medicines for the time. So for a time, Grace was a respected woman in this community. People came to her when they were sick or when they were having babies because she was very knowledgeable in these fields. Grace was described as a tall woman and as a handsome woman, which at that time meant that she was a very beautiful woman. Grace was also known to have a very good sense of humor, and she was apparently very witty and could hold a very engaging conversation. Grace also liked to do this peculiar thing of wearing men's trousers while working out on the farm. It was very scandalous for the time. How dare she want to wear practical clothing while working out on the farm? Now, unfortunately, these trouser-wearing incidences were causing heads to turn, mostly the heads of the husbands in the area, and the wives did not appreciate it. Grace was first accused of witchcraft in 1697. So one of Grace's neighbors accused Grace of putting a curse on his bull, and the bull got sick and died. Because I guess when your bull gets sick and dies, you blame the hot neighbor. And then another neighbor came out and accused Grace of cursing his crops and his pigs. Because when your crops and your pigs die, you blame your hot neighbor. So luckily for Grace, the colony of Virginia really didn't want anything to do with witch trials, considering that the Salem witch trials happened just a few years earlier in 1692. And the colony of Virginia did not want that sort of mass hysteria happening there. So the courts in Virginia threw away those witchcraft accusations against Grace. So the Sherwoods just ended up paying a fine. But what they kind of think happened was that those neighbors were using that sort of mass hysteria witch hunt that had just happened up north to their advantage. They thought maybe they could somehow recoup some of the money from their losses on their farms, from their crops dying, from their animals dying, trying to get some of the Sherwoods' wealth. So really, her neighbors were probably just trying to use this recent tragedy to try to scam their neighbors. In 1698, Anthony and Elizabeth Barnes accused Grace of witchery. So Elizabeth Barnes claimed that she woke up in the middle of the night to see 2 figures standing at the foot of her bed, one of them being Grace and one of them being a dark, tall figure with a goat's head and glowing red eyes. Then Mrs. Barnes said that the tall, dark figure disappeared and Grace turned into a black cat. And then that black cat pounced onto Mrs. Barnes and started scratching her face up. And then when this black cat was done scratching Mrs. Barnes' face off, it sauntered off and then jumped through the keyhole in the door. Mrs. Barnes said all of that in a courtroom. So needless to say, the Virginia courts that did not want to deal with witchcraft nonsense threw that case out as well. In 1701, Grace's husband, James Sherwood, passed away. And when he passed away, he left everything to Grace. He left Grace the land and the farm, making her one of the few women landowners of the time in the area. And while this would have been very fortunate for anyone else, it essentially made Grace a target. In 1705, Grace took Luke and Elizabeth Hill to court for assault. According to Grace, Elizabeth Hill came to her farm and attacked her. She said in court that Elizabeth, she assaulted, bruised, maimed, and barbarously beat her. And Grace won this case, and she got 20 shillings out of the Hills for it. Now the Hills did not like this humiliation at all, so Mr. Hill went back to the courts and claimed that Grace had put a hex on his wife. And that's why a possessed Mrs. Hill went to Grace's farm and beat her up. And then he also claimed that his wife was pregnant at the time and that the possession had caused her to have a miscarriage. So unfortunately, the courts were just sort of over this constant accusation of witchcraft of Grace Sherwood. So they got a tribunal together of knowing and ancient women, which ended up being a committee of all the local women who already hated Grace and were suspicious of her. And one of the women on this committee was Elizabeth Hill. So obviously this was going to be a very fair trial for Grace. So basically this tribunal women had to find evidence that Grace was a witch. So first these women searched Grace's house, and they didn't find anything there, even though they could have easily found something. But it's speculated that these women were kind of scared that Grace would put a hex on them or enchant them or something if they did find some evidence there. So then the courts made them go back and search Grace herself. So they made Grace strip down so that they could search her body for a devil's mark. And a devil's mark could be anything from a birthmark to a scar to a freckle. Pretty much any blemish that you could find on the body, they could consider a devil's mark. And finding one of these marks meant that you'd made a pact with the devil. So of course they found the devil's mark on Grace. So yeah, we would have all failed that test. It's my devil's mark. I made that pact with the devil long ago. So I guess the hot neighbor wasn't so hot. She had a blemish on her skin, making a pact with the devil. So these women take their evidence to the local court. And now the local court decided to take it all the way to the Capitol in Williamsburg. So they dragged Grace all the way up to this trial in Williamsburg. And essentially, the Williamsburg court told them to kick rocks. Because again, they didn't want anything to do with witchcraft. They told them to go home and figure it out. So now the Princess Anne County Court couldn't find any evidence of witchcraft. But because of all the suspicion surrounding Grace, they decided to just jail her anyway. So on July 5th, 1706, in Lynnhaven Parish Church, which was the same church that Grace had married her husband James years before, the court decided to try Grace by water for witchcraft. Trial by water was essentially a death sentence. They would bound your hands and your feet together, throw you in the water, and if you sank, you weren't a witch. But if you floated to the top of the water, you were a witch and they would execute you. So either way, you didn't make it out alive. I could only imagine what Grace was feeling in that moment. Probably just pure terror that the community that she had grown up in and lived her whole life in were going to murder her. On July 10th, Grace was brought to what is now known as the Ferry Plantation House, which is a house that still stands today in the city of Virginia Beach. But at that time, it was the Ferry House because it was right on the Lynnhaven River, and that's where they took Grace to perform her witch dunking. And sadly, the whole community turned out for this witch trial. It essentially was free entertainment. People brought their whole family, little kids, to hopefully watch an execution. Just good old Puritan family fun. So they bring Grace out, and the whole crowd starts yelling, "Dunk the witch! Dunk the witch!" So then they bound Grace's hands and feet together, and then for extra measure, they put like a 15-pound Bible onto her chest. They get her into the boat and then row her out 200 yards out into the Lynnhaven River. Now it's claimed that before Grace was thrown into the water, that she yelled to the crowd that before this day is through, you will all get a worse dunking than I, my bitch. So then they throw Grace into the water, and Grace, being the resourceful little farm girl that she was, untied herself, and she swam back up to the surface. And now, of course, the whole crowd is like, oh my god, she is a witch. Because only witches know how to untie knots, apparently. And when they pulled Grace out of the water, the sky darkened. The rumbling of thunder was heard in the distance, and lightning lit up the sky. And then the whole crowd is drenched by a torrential rainstorm. So now there's no doubt in anyone's mind that Grace is a witch. And after that, Grace was thrown in jail. And people were hoping that that was the end of all this witchcraft nonsense. Grace was essentially thrown away and was expected to be forgotten about. It's said that Grace probably spent around 7 years imprisoned. But then, rumors started to circulate again. People were seeing dark figures sneak in and out of the jail at night. So this just got all the witchcraft rumors circulating again. I guess Grace was having demon parties in her jail cell. But more than likely, it was probably just her children coming to see her and making sure that she was being treated well and fed and had things that she needed. So once these rumors started circulating again, the courts decided to just let her go. They were over it, they were over dealing with it, and I don't think they wanted to keep this woman in prison her whole life because of these rumors and speculations. So Grace went home back to her farm and lived out the remainder of her life quietly. She left everyone alone, and they all left her alone. Grace died in 1740 at around the age of 80. And poor Grace, even after she died, people could not get over these witchcraft rumors. So because of that story about her where she had turned into a cat, after she died, people started cats in the area because they thought that her spirit was possibly possessing one of these cats. But there was a little bit of karma that came from this, because after all the cats were gone, Princess Anne County went through something they called the Great Infestation, because rats overtook the whole county. So because all the cats, they got all the rats. So the Sherwood house was still standing up into modern times. And of course, the local teens would like to go there and party and maybe get a glimpse of Grace. Now, the city didn't like this because partying teenagers are a liability. So they destroyed the house, but the 2 chimneys still stood. So of course, people still kept going there. And of course, people claim to see the spirit of Grace there. Ghost hunting teams that go out there claim to get EVP recordings of Grace's voice or whoever's voice. They get pictures of like orbs and stuff, claiming that it's Grace. The poor woman cannot get peace even in death. But people also claim to see Grace's spirit at the Fairy Plantation house, where she was for like all of a day when she had her witch ducking. On July 5th, 2006, Governor Tim McCain officially exonerated Grace of witchcraft. They put up a statue for her across the street from the church that she was married in and then jailed in. And that statue sits right outside of a hospital, which is kind of fitting for a woman who in life was a healer and a midwife. Grace Sherwood today is now an urban legend. She left behind a very unique legacy in the area that she lived and died in. Books have been written about her, streets have been named after her, and so I've heard, children who grew up in the area are told that if they aren't home by the time the streetlights come on, that the Witch of Pungo will get them. But more than anything, Grace Sherwood is a symbol of strength and endurance. No matter what people were accusing her of, she always stood up for herself. And no matter how hard these people were trying to get rid of her, she was going to live. And she did. And even though she had to go through 7 years of hardship in a jail cell, eventually she got to go home. She got to live the remainder of her years in peace. And to me, that says a lot about who Grace was as a person, the strength of her character. Throughout everything, she was who she was, and she was not ashamed of who she was. And she wasn't going to stop being who she was because people didn't understand her or wanted to take advantage of her for what she had. So hopefully the legend of the Witch of Pungo will live on, because Grace as a character, even a woman from the 1600s, can still find relevance today. And I'm sure that Grace, who struggled so hard in life, could find some sort of comfort knowing that people really bond with her and her story today.